Welcome, one and all, to another episode of Wild with me, Sarah Wilson. Now, as many of you here know, I've been talking for years about how our current worldview, our system, has expired. There's not much that I've not covered on the subject of complex systems or complex civilizational collapse. And now we're in it, like truly. But what will replace it? What comes next? Well, that's been the theme of this recent series of Wild that you've been listening to. What comes next, and how do we start to imagine and build this nebulous, unknown, unpoint-atable what comes next? Well, today's guest gets us a little solid with the picture. Author and systems thinker Jeremy Lent has produced a deeply researched manifesto, a roadmap to the actual civilization that will replace the current exploitative, destructive, and yes, collapsing one. He calls it an eco-civilization, which is the title of his book on the subject, and he describes this new civilization as a new operating system. Now, like me, Jeremy's work for many years has focused on how and why our current operating system has separated us from life and the patterns and relationships that keep life going. He writes about all of this in his previous award-winning books, The Patterning Instinct and The Web of Meaning. But also, like me, he reached a point where he knew he had to get real quick with what might become possible if we get cracking, and importantly, if we stop trying to save the current system. Now, in this chat, I ask what I imagine begs for many of you. Is humanity capable of making such a massive evolutionary shift? Because that's what it amounts to. Have we done it before? And what has been required? What's been involved in passing through what is often called a phase transition? In this chat, Jeremy and I cover fractal flourishing, fractal scaling, pro-social models of organising, reciprocal causality, and other ideas in and around exponential change that happens in nature and can happen to a civilization too. Ideas that I've touched on before and that generally bring great delight as we recognise the instinctual truth of these things in our being. Now, I personally found this chat really enlivening, and I think you will too. Now, of course, as always, please join Jeremy and I over on Substack, where you can ask questions and join a community conversation about what he and I discuss in the conversation that follows. And please share this episode as widely as you can. I don't sell protein or green powders here. And I don't sell mattresses or infrared masks or AI tools that can, bring you greater leadership skills. But I am able to keep this conversation going if more of you join it and if we get some critical mass going. So yes, perhaps after you've listened, send it to 3 people in your orbit, perhaps even 10. Okay, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jeremy Lent. Welcome to Wild, Jeremy Lent.
Well, thank you, Sarah. So glad to be here talking with you.
Yeah, it's really lovely because our work very much intersects. We have been writing about similar things in a sort of a similar pitch for a while.
Yeah, and it's so exciting that you have a book coming out right around the time that I do. So we've got like 2 launches, and it's almost, I get the sense, it's almost like you get to hear something in stereo. You got 2 different perspectives on things, and that's such a wonderful way for that to be happening. So quite an exciting time.
There's certainly something in the air, and we picked up on it about probably 3 to 4 years ago when we started writing these books. But look, I do want to talk your latest project, in which you get us to imagine a new civilization, what you call an eco-civilization. So we probably need to start by hearing from you what exactly an eco-civilization is and looks like.
Yeah, sure. A great place to begin, definitely. So, in simple terms, we can think of an eco-civilization as really like the vision of a total world system. We could call that a civilization that is based on the opposite of the foundations of the current system. So our current system, when you look at it deeply, which I know you and I both have, it's basically one that's built on extraction, exploitation, and like this wealth pump that sucks wealth to a tiny elite. What we're envisaging really is a system that instead simply sets the conditions for all beings to thrive on a regenerating earth. And of course, when you think about that for a minute, if you ask most people in the world, what would you think about a world system that's like that? They'd say, well, of course, that's the opposite. Isn't that just common sense? But that's the whole point, is that it's absolutely fundamentally different from our current system.
Yeah.
So that's really what an eco-civilization is in simple terms.
Can you describe what it would actually look like? Like it's
Oh,
it's us living in
yeah.
congruence, in attunement with, I guess, the natural patternings, but give us a bit
Yeah,
more of a
yeah.
flavor
I
of
mean, that's
things.
great. So, I mean, interestingly, in a way, it would look in some ways fundamentally different from our dominant system right now. And at the same time, very much like we'd feel very normal and at home in that place. It's not like we're not like saying going to Mars or just something absolutely totally different. So the ways in which it would be different is, and it would not be a system based on capitalism. It would not be a system based on the primacy of capital above all. It would not be a system based on artificial scarcity, where so many people are doing 2 to 3 jobs, like living the sort of precariat life and hoping they might just enough make enough to pay the rent, and freaking out in case somebody gets sick in their family and everything falls apart, and always struggling, always on the edge. And that's really the design of the system that is kind of using people to force them into this kind of workaday world, and extract from nature for that wealth pump, for the elites to become centibillionaires and all that stuff. There would be a system instead where there were caps on this extreme wealth, be a system basically where corporations were designed rather than to extract and dominate based on just shareholder value, were actually had to meet a triple bottom line just to keep their charters. A triple bottom line meaning not just profits, but also people and planet. It'd be a system that went, rather than focusing on what's called anthropocentrism, saying basically humans are the only species that has worth or dignity. Everything should be organized around humans. And then, of course, within humans, just that tiny elite. But rather than that, it would say we humans are stewards of the living earth. And it would and the basis of it would be basically an ecocentrism rather than anthropocentrism. And there'd be other things. We'd be basing it on putting power down to the lowest level in the system. We'd be looking at a complete revisualization of democracy, which maybe we can go into a little bit. These are some of the things. Those are the different things. What would be very much kind of we'd all feel at home is it would be designed around how we evolved as human beings, to be in collaboration, to be in community, to be really part of a group that where our own contribution is valued and where we value others, where we're connecting with other communities around us and with the living earth in a system that I call at some points fractal flourishing, where rather than a zero-sum game, we all do well by others doing well around us. So in that sense, it'd be very ordinary, and we'd actually feel just like we're doing our lives, where we're in community, we're with our family, or the sort of things that maybe at times in the dominant in our life right now, we pause and say, oh, that was a really lovely experience. That would just become more like the norm.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned fractal flourishing, and I definitely want to come back to that idea in a little bit. But really, what you're describing, it's kind of no reinvention of anything, because it's what we were doing before we decided to separate ourselves from the natural world.
Right.
So it's not anything new, but I think the one of the fundamental points, and you cover off this in your book right from the outset, that we sort of go, all very well. That sounds great, because it resonates. It resonates because we are from nature, and the separation is actually unnatural to us.
Right.
But I know that many people feel a very distinct resistance to this idea of humans reimagining the system, reimagining our civilization, as you say in the subtitle, to a world that works for us all. And there's that phrase, we can more easily imagine the end of the world before we can imagine the end of the system, of capitalism. And you start the book by saying that you refute Tina, the famous Margaret Thatcher declaration, that there is no alternative, Tina.
Right, exactly.
Can you flesh out this refutation?
Yeah.
And can you perhaps answer, because this really begs for me, have humans done this before? Have we done alternatives? Have we created or imagined new civilizations?
Yeah. Yeah, that that is a great question. And yeah, I'd love to go into that more. But first, let's talk just a little bit more than about what this means. This, why do we have this concept of Tina? There is no alternative. Um, and and we do. I mean, this is really fundamental to understand that since Margaret Thatcher uttered those words, basically around 1980, so it's like almost like two generations ago now. Um, that's actually has become almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like after the Berlin Wall fell and the end of communism, and the whole 20th century in a way was almost like this dialogue or this battle between capitalism and communism. Communism lost, capitalism won. Okay, that's it. That's the only system there is. And now even people who are trying to make the world a better place actually try to do it within the system. Like, oh, we need to invest in ecosystems. Well, try to get the banks to finance it. And let's see if we can get the billionaires to get profit from it, because that's the only way we can do it. So they immediately start to organize themselves around this dominant system. But one of the things that I discovered in the years of research I did on this book is that actually, for all the work that people are trying to do to fix the system, this system isn't broken, actually. The system's doing exactly what it was intended to do. It's had 500 years of this extraction, exploitation, and it's doing a great job. And it's extracting and exploiting faster and faster than ever before. A little bit like a cancer that is just doing super powerfully, eating its host body, until, of course, one day the host itself dies, and then the cancer's over too. So that's what's going on right now. But there's a concept that actually got developed by a philosopher called Antonin Gramsci all the way back in the 1930s. He was actually in Mussolini's jails at the time. He died there. And it's a concept called cultural hegemony, which essentially is this realization that when you have these elite forces taking over, of course, they'll definitely use violence at first to get their way. And they've done that now for hundreds of years in colonialism, enclosure movements and stuff. But it doesn't work to continue to use violence. You don't want to have like armed police in every corner of the city saying, do what we do, otherwise we're going to shoot you. I mean, they'll do that if it comes to it. But it's a lot easier if you can get a whole sort of layer of like lieutenants doing your work for you, which in our dominant world are people like public intellectuals, let's say like people like Steven Pinker as a perfect
Pinker.
example.
I knew you were going to mention him.
Or like this incredible database called the World in Data, which is incredibly valuable, but also is funded by the very people who want to maintain this and keep this story going. And then not just the intellectuals, but the lawyers and the accountants and the media, journalists. There's a whole array of people who basically are telling the same story. And the story basically is there is no alternative. So ordinary people just checking the news, checking what's going on, not really thinking that, not having time to even think that deeply about it. Everywhere you look, you hear the same thing. So you say, okay, well, that's what it is. It's a little bit like the story of those two little fish swimming in the ocean, and they're swimming away, and then a big fish swims by and says, nice water today, huh, guys? And swims off. And one little fish says to the other, what's water?
Yes.
Because you live in this, that you don't even realize there's something different. That's what basically this Eco-Civilization book is designed to show, that actually there are incredible, wonderful differences. There are people who have figured out in every aspect of what we call civilization, what's actually possible. So
Yeah.
my book really is not about me coming up with some brilliant ideas, but just actually researching and highlighting and weaving together the great ideas that are already out there. So anyway, so that's one way of looking at that.
So to the point, have humans done this before? How many
Yeah.
times have we done it before? You look back through history in all your work and track sort of,
Yeah,
how societies have flourished and
exactly.
fallen and shifted. How
Yeah.
have we done it before?
And we've only really done it this kind of change, this transformative change has actually only happened a couple of times in the whole human story. And, as you know, we spent sort of 95% of our species history as nomadic hunter-gatherers out there, self-organized in groups where we actually lived according to our evolved human niche, as this great evolutionary psychologist Darshan Narvaez calls it, the human evolved niche. Um, and then, for various reasons, we began to settle into places, what's known as sedentism, and agriculture arose around that same kind of time. And that was the big shift. Now, it took thousands of years to spread around the world, so it didn't happen overnight. But when it happened, it changed every aspect of the human lived experience, from the way we lived as in those roving bands to being parts of hierarchies. Patriarchy came into people's experience. The whole notion of possessions and wealth and inner out and fences and fencing off and all that stuff became part of the lived experience in almost every part of the world. And or even though empires and civilizations were very different, there was a certain similarity between almost all of them. Not every single one, by the way, but almost all of them, until the scientific revolution happened in early modern Europe around the 17th century or so. And that's a great place to look at change, because that was a more recent thing that happened where there was a transformative change. In this case, it took maybe, within Europe, it took maybe a few generations, not that long. And then through colonialism, it spread within a couple of hundred years through the rest of the world. And this is the worldview we've inherited now. This is the worldview of modernism that sees nature as a machine, that sees this almost, that's where capitalism began. That's where the limited liability corporation first began. It's where colonialism began. And not surprisingly, not coincidentally, notions of white supremacy began in that same time and place. So that's worth looking at, because, that was a transformation that was something that certain people led the way on. And there was actually Francis Bacon, for example, who was almost like the spokesperson for that transformation. He saw it as a transformation. I mean, he was really like, he had these statements he'd make, like, we can conquer nature. We can this is so exciting. For the first time ever, humans can find out nature's secrets. They use these strange metaphors of, we can put nature on the rack and torture her secrets out of her, which was consistent with what Francis Bacon was doing in his other part of his life, which was an interrogator for the for the royal family and all that stuff. But these were the metaphors used. But it was an exciting time for people, and this is where Descartes and Galileo and all these people got their inspiration from, because there was a sense that they were working together. And I examine in my book this concept of how transformation happens. And in my view, there's actually what they created in doing something like that is what I call a shared manifold of meaning, which is very much like there's a core concept. In that time, the core concept was nature is a machine, we can conquer her, kind of thing. And different people, Descartes and all these different scientists, the Royal Society began in London to bring in these people together. They all had shared that same sense, but they all did it in different directions. So they did their different stuff, but they all did it under the same umbrella of, this is what we're doing. We're all inspired by the same vision. So that's the kind of, this is, by the way, is very much how life itself works. There's a concept called reciprocal causality, which systems biologists look at. That's basically how the very first cells emerged in life on Earth, and actually stayed doing this now for billions of years in different ways. And reciprocal causality is a kind of geeky term, but it's a simple concept, which is that all the parts of some system create a whole, and that whole at the same time actually gives a sense of integration and a direction to all the parts. So the parts affect the whole while the whole affects the parts. That's the reciprocal causality part of it. So in that sense, you see the whole is this manifold of meaning, conquer nature, and the parts do their different things. And we actually see another example of that, not exactly a civilizational transformation, But what I really view as probably the most successful movement of the 20th century, which you might wonder, well, what is that? And I view it as basically the movement of neoliberalism, which got created by a group called the Mont Pelerin Society back in the 1940s. And there, they were freaked out at what they saw as rising fascism or state power, and they wanted to focus on individual liberty. And for them, that shared manifold of meaning was basically that, like individual liberty, which lots of people could be inspired by in different ways. And they consciously set around trying to shift the accepted narrative of what was considered acceptable. They called it the Overton window. And over decades, they, with one vision of individual liberty, they've pursued all these different directions, like academic departments at colleges, at universities, or media, or going to basically different civic organizations or businesses. And in doing that, they created a whole other ecosystem of change around that. So
Yeah.
the sense is, to me, the hopeful thing around that, maybe we can do something like that right now as this civilization unravels.
Well, yes. The immediate thing I think about is the Heritage Foundation and
Hmm.
Atlas and these other
Yeah, yeah,
contemporary think tanks that are
exactly.
doing a similar thing. But just to bring you back to sort of the original question, have we done this before? You're saying yes, we've done it maybe two significant times before, plus a sort of a third smaller time with the
Yeah, I think that's
neoliberal,
a
yeah,
good
two and a half
description of
times.
that. Yeah, yeah.
And from what I gather, you're saying we're about to go through a sort of a full third reckoning or transition. And I think, I certainly feel that as well. But what I also picked up from what you were saying is that something that's really central to these shifts is, I guess, almost a kind of shared mythology that is able to be created. That is actually what can get an entire civilization, entire society to shift, maybe not all at once, but certainly comprehensively, is
Right.
this shared ideology. And we can certainly see that sort of the capitalist and now neoliberal ideology is one that we feel is completely always already there.
Hmm.
There is no alternative. We're starting to see the cracks in all of that, but it is still quite a shift for a lot of people to understand that
Right.
we can create something else and that it will require a new type of storyline, a new
Hmm.
mythology. So I want to develop that a little bit further. What we're really talking about here is a civilizational phase transition,
Hmm.
where
Yeah.
there's a sort of a leap in complexity or exponential emergence. And you're saying that there's a number of things. There's this mythology. You've also talked about the fractal element, all of this.
Hmm.
And what I'm getting at is, could you maybe describe how this shift from one civilization into this nebulous unknown next civilization happens at scale? Now, as you said before, it doesn't happen super, super fast, but reasonably quickly, but it happens comprehensively around the globe, represented in
Hmm.
different sort of ways, but essentially it becomes the same civilization. So can you talk about some of those principles, go into a bit more detail on some of those principles, like the fractal flourishing, the fractal
Yeah.
scaling, and that idea of mythology that's required?
Hmm. Yeah. Maybe the first place to begin in understanding this is a little bit of the sense of basically how complex systems do change in fundamental ways. So, in my work, even though I'm not a systems theorist, I've gone really deep into understanding systems theory. People like Fritjof Capra, Ilya Prigogine, many others who look systems ways at how complex systems change. And systems matter because we are systems. We're all like life is a complex, dynamic, self-organized system. Our total human society is that. So this is more like an understanding of how these things actually change. And how they do it is basically they go from one stable state, which can be very stable for quite a long time, and then they go through a certain like a phase transition, which can be very messy, and then they emerge in a new kind of relatively stable state. And there's something called the adaptive cycle model of change, which people have found applies to everything from a single cell all the way to ecosystems and everything in between. And there's kind of these 4 stages. You have this conservation stage, very stable, which can last for a long time. Then a very scary release phase, say like something like a forest fire or something. That's the terrifying, can be very quick. And then that moves into basically a reorganization phase, which is kind of a little bit chaotic, but new ideas can suddenly spring up, like new seeds coming into a forest that couldn't have taken root before. And then a growth phase, and then it stabilizes into the conservation phase again. That's kind of a recognized cycle. But it's in that release phase is this kind of gooey mess. You go from this kind of collapse sort of thing to this like chaotic kind of space. And it's there that really where the opportunities arise too. So there's, I mentioned this one biologist, systems biologist called Ilya Prigogine. And what was interesting is he studied how basically a caterpillar that is one kind of organism goes into a cocoon and then emerges as a butterfly, right? Which is same DNA, but it's a completely different kind of organism. So it turns out in that mess, in that mushy cocoon there, he discovered, what are known as imaginal cells. So these are cells that are almost like you can literally get it, imagining what the butterfly will look like. But they actually get under attack from all the mush because they're different from what the mush is like. And over time, they call what he called, and sometimes the quote's attributed to him or people who have studied him, but islands of coherence in a sea of chaos, which emerge up to a different kind of order. And that's this beautiful, inspiring vision, because then we get it, what this is all about. And those islands of coherence connect with each other in that cocoon and slowly begin to form the framework for the butterfly. And the stronger it gets, the more it coheres around and ends up flying out as a butterfly. This kind of gives a sense of what we're about, what we need to be doing, and we are doing. And this is what my book looks at exhaustively, like a lot of different groups. They're creating those islands of coherence. There are already so many people in the world today who are living and working according to the values of that eco-civilization. These life-affirming values, working collectively, collaboratively, pushing power to the lowest level, connecting with all of life. And these islands of coherence, they have a lot of challenge because their very values work with the headwinds of our dominant system works against them. So I feel one of the most important things any of us can do that are wanting that better life for all of our future generations is to seek them out, support them, and also very importantly, connect them with other islands. Almost like imagine these islands as the sea of chaos begins to wither away, turning into more like an archipelago and then almost like a new mainland of what's possible.
That is such a wonderful way to describe phase transition, because it's quite a hard thing to get your head around. But it brings together quite a number of phraseologies that I've been using in my work and in this podcast series. This idea of slow at first and then all of a sudden. And that goes for both collapse, but it also goes for this idea of creating the what comes next. It's this idea that there's this leap in complexity and emergence. And it really does, I think, fill that void where people often feel so helpless because the task ahead seems so large.
Yeah.
But once people start to understand that, well, once we start a certain way of being, these islands of coherence, which actually are attuned to our real nature, there's this attraction that becomes exponential, and it gathers a momentum that we can't really fathom until we're in it, like the sort of the caterpillar that becomes a butterfly, it goes super fast once it actually emerges from this mushiness, as you describe it. So yes, I think this is something that we need to get our heads around. And can you add to this picture what you mean by fractal flourishing? You also talk about fractal scaling as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And so, one of the core themes of this eco-civilization vision is that it takes some of its core principles from life itself. And really, fractal flourishing is one of those principles. And so maybe it helps for a moment to just understand how life itself got to be so successful on this earth and how we live in this incredible rich
Please.
abundance. And it wasn't easy. It took a while for, I mean, life actually emerged through that process I was describing earlier, like the notion of what's called autopoiesis or reciprocal causality,
Yeah.
very early on. Just the first few 100 million years of Earth being existing. And Earth's been around for over 4 billion years, so kind of early on in its history. And then there's only been a few phase transitions. At first, life was basically just these simple cells. And then there was this transition to nucleated cells, which had far more energy, and then multicellular life. Even those two steps, each one took about 1 billion years. So it's kind of slow work. And then multicellular life led to actual organisms like animals, and then social animals. And each of these took way longer. Then suddenly, wow, this booming. So the thing that's crucial to understand is those steps up in complexity. Even though life has always had some level of cooperation and competition, those steps up came through cooperation, through what's called mutually beneficial symbiosis, which is a fancy term to basically say you got two species learning that by putting their skills together, they could form a whole that was greater than the sum of the parts. And that's how all of these phase transitions actually happened. So this is life's great secret, is networking, cooperation between species gives you more of an oomph than when you're trying to outcompete the people next to you. And humans actually turns out we're one of the most cooperative of all species. It was cooperation that really formed our identities.
That's something that I talk about a lot because we've lived in a culture where we've been told that we are inherently selfish. Therefore, you also need to be selfish and look out for yourself. But
Yeah.
that makes no sense. We are a feeble species. We don't run fast. We don't have horns. We don't have fangs. We've actually evolved to this point in the evolutionary chain because of our very, very sophisticated ways of being able to cooperate. We're the descendants of ancestors who were smart enough to know that cooperation is a better way to go than to be selfish. So it's sort of, the selfish gene and all of, again, Pinker's kind of thinking around this that says that we can't cooperate our way out of this is entirely wrong. It goes against the natural order. Yeah.
And this is what's so fascinating because like the selfish gene is a perfect example. So Richard Dawkins wrote that book, actually got published almost the same within a couple of years of Margaret Thatcher saying there is no alternative. So it's no coincidence that it sort of became the #1 bestseller among nonfiction books for years. Richard Dawkins is considered the most reputable sort of public scientist or whatever. And systems scientists for decades now have shown in every dimension it's absolutely wrong. That in fact, he says, to Dawkins, to his credit, he's a moral person. He doesn't want this competition. He says we have to overcome our selfish genes in order to be more moral. The opposite is true. We have feelings of things like embarrassment, what are called by social psychologists like moral emotions. We feel embarrassment, guilt. We love people who are generous. All these are collective a kind of emotions that evolved exactly like you said, through us as humans learning how to be together, evolving that over millions of years in our pre-hominid ancestors. So that's actually how we are actually are cooperative. So these ideas around an eco-civilization is bringing us back to our core nature. So to get to your point about fractal flourishing then, this is the exact opposite of that selfish gene hypothesis. Because what we're told in our dominant culture is it's like a zero-sum game. If I'm going to win, it means you got to lose. I got to outcompete you because there's only enough cake there. So the more cake I have, the less you have. That's what we're told. That's the way the world works. It's actually not the way that the life itself works. And it's not the way that we need to organize our human societies. Fractal flourishing basically recognizes this key to life's ecosystems, that for the different parts of an ecosystem to flourish, they do best when they are contributing to the flourishing of all around them. So we're all like, within us, we have cells, which then form organs, which form ourselves as an organism, which are then part of communities, which are then part of those populations and ecosystems. In every
And just to
case,
interrupt, and just to clarify for everyone,
yeah.
I mean, fractals are repeated patterns. So
Mm.
if you think of the petals of a flower, the fronds of a fern, the tree rings in a tree trunk, they're these sort of fractal patternings, and we have the same patternings in our eyes, for instance. Our retinas are made up of fractals. So yeah, sorry to interrupt there. I just thought I'd make that
thank
clear.
you. Thank you for and I'm very glad you did, because not everyone knows exactly that term. And so, like you say, it's everywhere in nature. And again, it's everywhere in nature because that's how nature evolved, because every part is part of something bigger. So the simple concept behind fractal flourishing is we can flourish ourselves, not as a zero-sum game, but contributing to the flourishing of the bigger systems around us. And that, by the way, is both a secret to how we can organize our societies through like pro-social modes of organization, which we can go into, but is also crucial to each of us as individuals. And I know you write about this a lot. That when we look at this collapse happening, and maybe we feel driven, well, I've got to become part of trying to work for something better, and there's sometimes a sense that if I'm doing okay, then that's kind of not good. I should feel guilty about that because I've got to put that energy into what's going out there. And there's almost like this trade-off between caring for myself or caring for what's out there in the world, which, can come from a very good, morally, ethically driven source, but can still lead to a lot of our internal suffering. But this was actually a lot of my own path too, is to discover actually what life wants from me is for me to be healthy and to flourish and not be driven so much by angst and despair that I feel and a sense of hopelessness or just basically can't contribute properly. But if I'm actually feeling healthy and alive, it enables me to contribute more to the health of the systems around me. So that's, to me, was a real path that took me a while to get to. But once you get there, you realize that we can all be doing that. We can build communities that don't feel they're flourishing at the expense of those around them, but actually contributing to that larger, greater flourishing.
So let's talk about those pro-social modes of organizing. Let's talk real examples of how an eco-civilization might be able to look, and how maybe it's already starting to take hold around the world. So maybe in terms of, governance, finance, law, cultural, family, and even city setups. Can you maybe just talk us through 2 to 3 examples of what you're talking about here? Systems that are going to look different and are already in play.
Yeah, sure. Well, one way to begin, for example, I mentioned earlier about in an eco-civilization, corporations wouldn't have this stranglehold, like these for-profit corporations over what we do. And right now, for example, if you look at the 100 largest economies in the world, 69 of them are not even countries, but are these massive for-profit corporations whose very design is to extract and exploit to the maximum possible. But an example of really an island of coherence is you can have cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives, that can be every bit as sophisticated and successful in the whole world today as those for-profit corporations. A great example is in the Basque country in Spain. It's called Mondragón. And it's this big, sophisticated organization with many companies, about 80,000 workers, and those workers are worker owners of the entire system. And the whole priority of the system is not to make profits, but actually to make the quality of lives for the people doing the work as good as possible. And the pay ratio between the highest paid CEO of one of these companies and the lowest paid worker, like sweeping the floors, is no greater than 6 times one to the other, anywhere through the organization, rather than thousands of times as you have in modern American type of corporations now. So that's one example of a true island of coherence, showing what's possible. Then another one, which I think is really interesting, is around governance and democracy. Like, we're a part of our sort of that myth of cultural hegemony, is, we think that we have democracy, at least in countries that are known as democracies, such as European countries or some of the Anglo-speaking countries. In this country I'm in, the United States, obviously it's under attack, and we're trying to maintain democracy as much as possible. But the point I discovered in my research is we don't even have a democracy. But these electoral systems are more like an electoral oligarchy, where you essentially every 4 or 5 years, people get to choose between one elite group that says we want to do it this way, or another elite group that says we want to do it that way. And one group might be a little more humane than the other. But then once we vote them in, they basically dictate what goes on for another 4 or 5 years. And what those politicians really care about more than anything, for the most part, is getting reelected. And they'll take in the money, and they'll make sure that the corporations and billionaires who fund them are happy so they can get the funding to get reelected next time. But there's another alternative that's actually much more consistent with what true democracy was like all the way back in ancient Athens when Aristotle talked about it. And it's been developed the last few decades, what are known as citizens' assemblies. You remember I talked before about the notion of giving power to the lowest level possible in the system as part of what an eco-civilization is about. So citizens' assemblies basically draw on ordinary people, actually literally by lottery. So you get a random selection of ordinary people coming together to deliberate on big decisions that affect society as a whole, such as, abortion, or future, like looking out for future generations, or education issues or health issues. And they do so over sometimes weeks or months of deliberation that are facilitated. And first we might say, how could that possibly work? Look at this polarization. Like, you put all these people together, they'll just be at each other. The opposite happens. When people realize they're being given the responsibility to actually work together collectively for society as a whole, they take that seriously. It kind of almost brings back some of those evolved human drives that we were talking about earlier. And what happens is when they're facilitated well, they come up with, and when they actually can interrogate and examine subject experts, so they're not just in the dark, they actually get to ask the questions they want. They come up with better quality recommendations than politicians almost ever do. And, like Ireland's a perfect example, where there was a question about legalizing abortion. The politicians were terrified that if they came out on the wrong side, and half the country would hate them, they wouldn't get reelected. So they gave the hot potato to the Citizens' Assembly to do. They did this deliberation over months. It was transparent. Basically, it became a public conversation, but without the toxicity that would happen otherwise. They came up with a recommendation to legalize abortion with certain parameters. It went to a referendum. About 2/3 of the country voted in support of it. It was a beautiful example of what's possible when you actually consciously give power to ordinary people.
They're two really good examples. I know that your book goes into a whole bunch more. And I think where it all lands with me is that I do feel that there is a possibility. The more and more I go into this work, I do feel there is a possibility of creating a civilization, or what comes next, that is actually going to serve humans, and it's going to produce flourishing. It's going to be life improving, life enhancing, rather than life destroying. And it really strikes me, just, sort of listening to you and reading your work, that what's missing here is a full understanding that there is an alternative, and that it's a lot easier than we imagine it to be. Really, it's about joining nature. It's joining the natural flow and order of things that existed before we decide to put our grubby hands all over things and create, post-industrial civilization. Do you feel that there's almost like some kind of silver bullet to get people to that spot? Is it about really educating people in interconnectedness? And then once they understand their interconnectedness, they can see the patternings that allow something new to come forth. What do you feel is the thing that we're missing right now?
Yeah.
And I suppose I've also got to throw into the mix here, is it the collapse? Is it the brutal, destructive collapse of the current system that is required for us to
Mhm.
actually get to
Yeah.
that space?
Yeah. These are two, big and very important questions. And so, well, let's talk to that first one first. What's needed, basically? Oh, I think the first thing that's needed is to move beyond the othering and that is so prevalent right now that helps the forces for separation and oppression um, even more. So
Mm,
I think it's very important that we get beyond seeing like the us versus them. We're the good guys who want a better life, and they're the bad people who do this oppression. And because as soon as we do that, we create more separation. And then even if we think that we're the good guys kind of won, quote unquote, and ended up in power, maybe temporarily in an election or whatever, then half the country then feels opposed. And so it's getting beyond this polarization is key. And I think one of the ways we do that is each of us basically goes back to our hearts and minds and connects with other people. Because what's really needed is not to try to out argue people and tell them they're wrong and get them to see that there's a different way. Actually, it turns out, cognitive scientists show that actually the smarter people are, the better they are at forming their own arguments as to why they're right and you're wrong. And the harder it is to actually even get them to ever change their mind. So even if you can spend 2 hours arguing with somebody, you think you've won your great points,
mm. It's not
and
about
they'll
educating the
walk away
masses.
saying, "Ah,
Hmm.
that bunch of crap." So what is needed is actually connect with people's hearts, actually hear them, actually
Yeah.
recognize them as other human beings of dignity and worth. And if they putting out ideas of hatred or that seem to be based on inadequate understandings, try to get to the deeper layers of where did they come up with those feelings? What was the hurt? What was the pain that caused them to feel that? What do they really want? Usually what people really want deep down is the same as what we all want. They want health. They want to be respected. They want their own grandchildren to like grow up in a healthy and happy world and a happy life. And once you start from that place, you can begin to build something different. So I think that that's a key thing is to reach out through heart connections with people, and not just those we're related with, almost especially those who we might find disagreements with. So that's one issue. But that other one about, collapse, that's such a big, big issue. So, we, of course, both you and I have looked close at what's going on, and it's a terrifying place we're in. And we know there's all kinds of indicators that we seem to be headed
Mm.
towards some kind of collapse. The thing I would say is that while it's clear that we are going through this massive phase transition, there's nothing inevitable about the exact path we're on. This is another learning from studying nonlinear complex systems. No matter how well we think we see where it's going, there's always this unpredictability. And it's in that unpredictability that I actually see the hope, those glimmers of hope arising for what's possible. Because a total collapse, in my view, would be basically almost like the worst catastrophe ever to have to happen to humans as a species. We'd be looking at mega deaths of billions of people, violence,
Yeah.
disease, terror, horrible for the last thing any of us want. But the thing is, the metaphor I love to use is the kind of concept of an unraveling, because we know that things are coming apart at the seams basically right now. What we don't know is exactly how that'll happen, exactly how long it'll take, and where and when it's going to happen the most. So you can almost think of it, imagine like a rug, a tightly woven rug, and you want to change the design of it. But you can't even begin to pull out any actual threads because it's so tightly woven. But imagine that rug itself starts unraveling, which is what our entire civilization is doing. It's almost like it opens up the degrees of freedom to reweave that fabric in a different pattern before the whole thing comes apart. And that's a challenge. I'm not saying that's easy, but to me, that kind of defines what our challenge collectively is right
Yes.
now. Things are coming apart. Can we reweave them before they completely go to hell?
Which
And
really
I feel,
emphasize which
yeah,
really emphasizes what an important moment we're in. Like it's a potent moment.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, and we were talking before. Yeah, I mentioned about one example of a successful transformation movement was this rise of neoliberalism, and that was happening when crises happened. Neoliberalism took hold of our entire world system in the 1970s when the actual old system was falling apart a bit. You had stagflation and all kinds of stuff going on, and people were feeling things are not working. We have a real crisis. And let me just give you a quote of one of the architects of that rise in neoliberalism. Um, People know him well. His name was Milton Friedman. And
Yeah.
he actually said, and I bet you know this quote well, but yeah, only a crisis produces real change. And he said, when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And he even said that's our basic function, him and his neoliberal colleagues, right? To develop alternatives, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable.
Yeah.
And so to me, I mean, it's
That's
weird
what
to
those
get
congruent
inspiration
islands
from
are, those islands of congruency, right? They're the ideas that need to
exactly.
be lying around as the rug starts to unravel, and there needs to be some fabric, there needs to be some tension, there needs to be
Yeah,
some weaving skills available to bring it all back together again, into a new rug. I use that quite a
exactly,
lot, and I
Sarah.
think it very much, I think, is a rally call to us all, is to actually be
Yeah,
engaged now in those ideas. Um, Jeremy, I think that's actually probably a good note to finish on. You answered my question
yeah,
beautifully. I really did want to finish with this idea of whether collapse is something that's necessary with all of this. And in so many ways, if we see it as a unraveling, yes, I believe it is. It is an
mhm,
opportunity for us to get things open and available, and for the warp and the weft to be, loose enough to inject
yeah,
those new ideas.
yeah.
There is one last final question that I do ask all guests in this series, and that is, how do you cope as a human in all of this? How do
Mm.
you be in this, I guess, this time of messy, mushy transition?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And just like everyone who's honest about it, yeah, it's not easy. I mean, I have been through many times over the years just looking at how bad things are and the angst, the sense of the absolute depth, the it's almost like an agony to actually look at how these things are unfolding, the incredible the loss of life's richness, the terrible oppression going on for billions of humans on this earth right now, and realizing how, my privilege is part of contributing to that. It's very hard. And I think to me, one of the most valuable things for me is learn this, from practices of internal family systems to allow those parts within me and to honor them. Like I'm not so, and I have a voice in me. I sort of always put it on my left shoulder kind of thing for some reason. It's like in my left ear going, it's a disaster. It's a hopeless situation. Look how bad things are. You got to be kidding. So I feel this every day. This is not like I'm not saying like I've just seen the light and that's all there is. But the point is, I hold that, and I know that these parts within me are to be honored. They're looking at the suffering. They're in pain. They feel that, and we can
Yeah.
honor those without necessarily orienting towards them as voices or as parts. And we can then realize the whole of us is part of the living earth. We're part of life, and we're called to do what life needs us to do. And to me, it's only when we go there and we do that not alone, but we turn to others and we share that grief. We share that sense of angst with others. And we actually collaboratively really hold each other's in our sort of respective arms, and then move with that sense of solidarity towards engaging, towards doing something, which then allows us to feel we are helping to co-create whatever the future is. We're not helpless, even though those powers that be, want us to feel helpless. We're not.
Yeah, wonderful. Internal family systems or parts sort of theory or therapy. I've dabbled in that a little, and it's certainly helped as well. It's another tool for regulating the nervous system as well, so that we can be
Yeah.
best able to be those islands of congruency, be part of the building of those islands of congruency. Hey, Jeremy, Lent, that was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for all your work, and good luck with your new book, Ecocivilizations. I'll put a link to it and the other sort of discussion groups, online discussion groups that you hold. I'll put all of those in the show notes.
That's
I hope
great.
to cross
Thank you,
paths
Sarah.
with you at some point
Great.
down the line.
Great talking with you, and good luck with the launch of your new book. It looks super exciting. I can't wait to get a hold of it and read it myself.
I'll get one
Thank
to
you.
you. Thank you so much.